So this morning we are continuing our lessons on 1 Corinthians. And like the last two lessons, we're spending some time this morning talking about how the Corinthians connected and dealt with their Christian faith while they lived in the culture in which they lived. And I'm just going to warn you before we jump into the text this morning, you're going to think like I am just jumping from place to place in the text, and in some ways you are completely right. There are actually three different ways that they kind of related culture to culture in what we're going to be talking about this morning. So we're going to kind of jump around a little bit, and to be honest with you, I have thought through this sermon probably 3 or 4 times trying to figure out the order that I wanted to do this, and it's probably going to change as I go through the sermon. So the only thing I know to tell you is just hang on and we'll get to where we're going to get when we get there. Is that fair enough? So what we're going to talk about today is how the Corinthian church dealt with idolatry in their culture. And it's kind of hard to talk about because there are not a lot of really close side-by-side comparisons to what we do in our culture. But there's some really great lessons that we can learn from the way that they dealt with their culture. And some of that, we need to kind of step back from that for a second and think, how did it work in their culture? And kind of what are we talking about, and what would it have looked like? So this is what I told you I was going to be slipping around because even my slides aren't in order. So there are kind of 3 things that Paul addresses about idolatry in his culture. The first one was, can I go to a pagan temple where there's something going on to a pagan god? The second one, and we'll talk about how this kind of works in their culture, is, well, if it's not like a dedication to a pagan god, if there's just something going on in the temple, would it be okay for me just to go there? And could I do that? The third question had to do with what you would buy in the marketplace. And so, and this is not a really good comparison. It's the only one that I could come up with, all right? Anybody ever gone to the grocery store and you're not really going after like a T-bone steak or a rack of ribs or a brisket, but you get to Kroger and you get to the meat counter and it says sale. And you look on it and you see, well, the reason it's on sale, it's going to expire tomorrow. And I don't have time to cook it today. How many of you would go ahead and buy it because it says sale, and you would go home and put it in the freezer and cook it sometime later because you get just like a really good price? That would be me. And so you go down to the marketplace, and there's this meat in the marketplace, and there's some indication that some of that meat that has been sacrificed to an idol has found its way to the marketplace, which was very common, and it was being sold at a little bit of a cheaper price than some other meat that you could buy, and you're looking at the sale rack, and you're thinking, hey, would that be okay? Would that be okay? So there's 3 things that are going on, and Paul addresses those 3 in different places of the text, and that's why it'd be great if Paul just says A, B, and C, but that's not what he did, so we're going to bounce around a little bit to make it fit, all right? So I want you to, we're going backwards for a second. This all happens in 1 Corinthians 8:1 through like 10:33, if you want to read all of that together. And here's kind of a background verse. We looked at this last week when we talked about sexual immorality in their culture, and the same thing is true about idolatry in their culture. Paul says, he writes, everything is permissible. And remember, I think that's a Corinthian slogan. I don't think that's Paul's concept that everything in Christ is permissible, because Paul was very specific. There are some things you just don't do. But not everything's beneficial. And if somebody wanted to say everything is permissible, like I can just do whatever I want because of grace, then Paul would say, but not everything is constructive. And he doesn't mean constructive just for you. He means constructive for the church. He means constructive for your fellow Christian. And he says, what you judge things by is not what is your right, what I just have the right to do. You judge things by what is beneficial for your fellow believer and what is constructive for your fellow believer. So understanding that, we're going to talk about, well, what do we do about things that happen in a pagan temple? So the first one is 1 Corinthians 10, 14 through 22. And this is a situation where he uses communion as an example. Now, the text is not about communion per se. The text is about idolatry in pagan temples. But he uses communion as an example. So if you want to follow along, it was too long of a text to put on there. You can either look at your Bible or you can listen as I read. Now, here's the key. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. So whatever he says after this, what does this have to do with? Flee. And what do you do with idolatry? Flee. Okay, just so in case you get confused, there are two kinds of fleas. One's the kind that's on a dog, and that's not the one we're talking about. So if I say flee, what does that mean? Run away, right? Go the opposite direction. Run. You would, just making sure you got the right flee. Flee from idolatry. I speak to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. Now think about what we just did in this church. The cup of blessing that we bless, is it not a participation in the blood of Christ? What's he talking about? The cup of blessing, what is it? Communion. The bread that we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ? Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. So what we just did, I want you to think about this. This is not the sermon. This is an illustration, okay? What I want you to think about is when you participate in this communion, in this supper, you are participating in the body and the blood of Jesus. Consider the people of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices participants of the altar? Now, what was that about? Do you remember that? When you brought an offering to God in the Old Testament, what did you do with part of it? You ate it. Sometimes there, sometimes somewhere else, but you eat part of it. What do I imply then? That food offered to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? Okay, so for Paul, when he sees the statue of Apollo, is a statue of Apollo anything? No, it's not anything. It's just a bunch of stone. Remember in Isaiah, God said, you worship gods that are made out of stone and wood. They can't walk, they can't even carry themselves. You got to put them on a donkey to get them from one place to the other. That's not any kind of God. Is that statue anything? No, statue's not anything. No, I imply that what the pagan sacrifice they offer to demons and not to God, and I don't want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? Is that idol anything? No. Stone or wood or metal. Have any life in it? Like our God has life in it? No. That's not Paul's point. What is behind that idol? It's okay, y'all can talk. What is behind that idol? A demon. I'm going to ask you a question. Is the demon real? You better believe it. You better believe it. And you never go to a place where there is any indication that you are giving any kind of recognition or any kind of worship to any kind of demon. You do not do that. You do not go to a pagan temple and offer some type of sacrifice to some kind of pagan god, because even though the god is nothing, there is something behind that God that manifests itself in this world as being demonic. So you look at that temple of Apollo, maybe it looked like that's somebody's representation. This is what we have standing there now, which is not much. Do I go to where Apollo is and worship him? No. You think, well, Greg, what does that mean? We don't have a temple of Apollo down in Pleasant View or Joelton or Springfield. I mean, I don't know how far you got to go to find the closest temple of Apollo. Got a feeling it's going to be a little while. But do you see anything in our community that's a visible representation of Satan's influence in the world? That's what you stay away from. Because you know the demons that were behind that idol are the same demons that are behind some things that happen in our culture. And even though you say, well, I got a right to do it, it's not a question about whether you have the right to do it. It's a question about, is it the right thing to do? Now, I wish this could be a much longer sermon because we really fleshed that out. We may have to come back to that in another sermon series, all right? Now, but we need to kind of look at something else. 1 Corinthians 8. How about if I just go to the temple and I do something there, but it's not worship? Now, the thing that throws us into confusion with that is when we think about temples and we think about churches. And when we think about churches, we think about things like our church. And so in our church, what do we do? What is the church building for? It's for us to come and gather together and worship God. And we get in our mind that a church building and a temple was the same thing, but they weren't the same thing. The temple was not a place where you came to all gather together to worship the God. The temple, in their thought, was, I mean, it's like a center of activity in the first century world. And one of the ways that the temple is the temple is kind of where that God lives. It's his house. And that's where he lives. Now, that doesn't mean that they think he was there all the time, or they didn't really think that that idol in there represented anything, or that image. I mean, a god at that time, it could take on the form of an animal, or it could take on the form of something that happens in the world, or a storm. It could be anywhere. It was a god. It wasn't physical. It was spiritual. But that was the place that was kind of designated as the place that he lived. Kind of like, this is not a great comparison, but the best one I could come up with, it's kind of like a post office box. It's kind of like a post office box. If you want to take something to the God, that's where you take it. Now, why would you take something to the God? Y'all can talk. It's okay. Why do you take something to the God? What do you want to do? Keep him happy. Oh, woo, we got to keep him happy. Right? We've got to keep him happy. Now, remember, their concept of God is not like our concept of God sometimes. What's he going to eat? What we bring to him. We got to bring him something to drink. We got to bring him something from the harvest. Now, if we can keep him happy, boy, this kind of really messes us up because we think about God sometimes this way, and this is not the way we're supposed to think about God, all right? If we can keep the God happy, if we can keep Apollo happy, what happens? Oh, we get good things. We get good things. So the city's getting ready to do something special. What do we need to do? Let's take something to Apollo. Keep him happy. What if we don't keep him happy? Bad things, that boy gets mean, doesn't he? Oh, bad things happen. Yeah? I'm going to get way in trouble for this, but it's kind of like that saying in our culture, if mom ain't happy, ain't nobody happy, right? So you got to keep him happy. And if he's not happy, things aren't going to go well. So we got to bring our stuff to him. We got to keep him happy. And there's a temple spot where he is, and it's kind of dedicated. It's very, only the priest of the god can go into that kind of enclosed space. And you might think of it like, just for comparison's sake, like the holiest of holies. But outside this temple, you've got all of these other rooms. You've got these columns and colonnades, and you've got these little places off to the side. I don't think I have a picture of any of this. But you got all of that stuff going on. I don't even know where I'm in my notes. So, and you got all of that happening. And so, all of the time, it wouldn't be worship to a temple or to a god. Let's say I'm in a trade guild. For comparison, like a union, right? And we want a place to meet. Where might we go? Temple. We go to one of those offshoot rooms on the temple. We'll go over there and meet. What if we have a big family gathering? Anybody ever had a family gathering and used the fellowship hall of the Clarksville Highway Church of Christ? Amen. Praise the Lord. Thankful it's there. What if I wanted to have a big family gathering? Where might we go to find a spot big enough? We might go to that temple. What if there's a big civic meeting? We're going to get together and vote on the next mayor. Not that they did that, but if they were going to get together and vote on the next mayor, where might they go? to that temple. And they might go there and participate in that. And the question is, as a believer, can I go there and do that? Would it be okay for me to go to some kind of event that happened there, knowing that I'm not going to worship the God, I'm just going there for the event. I'm just going for the get-together. I understand that God is not anything. Now, 1 Corinthians chapter 8, food sacrificed to idols. And we kind of get this one and the last part of 10 kind of discombobulated sometimes, because this is just not about food that's sacrificed to idols or food in the marketplace. This is about food that you would eat at the temple. And so when you get down there and it says, for if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, and the text there is reclining in the temple, and the way you would eat is recline, right? So you go to some kind of meeting and you're eating there because they're not so much unlike us. I mean, what do we always do if we're going to have fellowship? We're going to eat. I mean, I don't know if every church does that. Clarksville Highway, we eat. We're going to get together, we're going to eat. It just works that way, right? And so you're there and something's going on, and so you're reclining in the temple, you're eating. Now, he goes through that. Remember in verse 4, as to the eating of food offered to idols, we know that idol has no real existence, right? He's not anything. There's one God, God alone. And although there's many so-called gods, yet for us there's one God. He says, hey, we understand the idol's not anything, is it? It's not about what they say is there. We know that whatever they got there that calls God, it's not a God. There's only one God, and so that idol has no real existence at all. And some of you know that. Here's a kicker. Some of them know that, and some of them don't know that. Imagine for a moment that you were Gentile and you grew up in that culture, and everything that you had done had been circulated around that idol temple, and every time you thought about that idol temple or something at that temple or a gathering at that temple, you thought, man, all of that, they dedicated that to God. They dedicated that to Apollo. Can't have that. There's only one God. And Paul says, let me tell you something. I'm not going to tell you not to go. And he doesn't. He doesn't really get in there and say, hey, don't you go do that. He says, you might have the right to go because you understand that temple's God is nothing. But you know what? It's not really about what you think is right. It's not really about your right to do something. How about your brother that sees you going there? What if you go there and you recline at that temple, and your brother who doesn't have that kind of knowledge sees you reclining in that temple, and he comes in and then he says, well, I guess I ought to do that too. You know, I saw Charles Moffett doing it, so I reckon I ought to do it. Guess it'll be all right. Well, my conscience says I ought not to do it, but Charlie did it. Must be okay. Well, I don't really want to do it though, but I'll go. Be careful that the exercise of your freedom does not become a stumbling block to the weak. You know what bothers me about this verse more than anything is verse 12, chapter 8. Sinning against your brother and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. Man, that is powerful. You mean when I sin against my weak brother and I do something that causes him to stumble, I sin against Christ? Yeah, you do, because he's the one for whom Christ died. So you know what? It's not about your right. What should you do to build up your brother? Because that's a different question. So Paul is not saying you can't go. But in a way, he's saying, probably ought not to. Probably ought not to. Then he gets to the third one. How about this food that's in the marketplace? How about this food that's been sacrificed to an idol? What do we do with that? Can't really see this very well, but I'm just going to kind of point. So right here is the Temple of Apollo, and right here is the Agora. The Agora was the marketplace. That's the place where you would buy stuff. There's this really cool picture when we went to Corinth. I think Diane took this picture actually. This is actually kind of the doors that would have gone into different places in the marketplace. You would have gone to the marketplace. It'd be kind of like going into a store. You kind of browse from store to store. Think about going to a mall, except it's just this big square, right? And you go to the mall, you wandering in and out of places and going from store to store. And some of it in the Agora wouldn't have been into a store like that. Some of that would have been the more wealthy merchants. Some of it would have just been out in the square, in the street. It's a pretty big area. And I'm going to be very honest with you. Before I went to Corinth, I thought, you know what, when I read 1 Corinthians, I'm just going to tell you, I'd be one of those kind of educated, knowledgeable, knowing kind of brothers who would just know that, you know, if you wanted to eat that meat that was sold down in the marketplace, I think that'd probably be all right. I felt that way till I went to Corinth. When I went to Corinth, I stood in the marketplace and I looked up. What are those columns? It's okay, you can say it. Anybody know what those columns are? That's the Temple of Apollo. I kind of thought it was on the other side of town. It wasn't on the other side of town. It was in the shadow of the temple. You'd be sitting there buying that meat, looking up, and there's the Temple of Apollo. Maybe you hear an animal making a noise, or maybe you hear an animal being killed. You'd see people dancing around maybe in that area, or you'd see people going in and out of Apollo's temple and bringing gifts to him. And you stand in the Agora, and you look up. What do you see? Way up on the hillside, on the other side. Anybody remember? Temple of Aphrodite. And you think about, boy, I know what's going on up there. And in that meat that's been sacrificed to that idol, they're bringing it down here and they're putting it in this marketplace. And they're asking me if I want to eat it. And I always thought, oh, I'd be one of those guys. Oh, yeah, man, just remember there's only one God, everything we could. I'm telling you right now, if I had lived in Corinth, I'd have been the one standing up saying, you ought not to be eating that stuff. I'm telling you right now. And my whole philosophy, my whole thought about that changed when I saw what ancient Corinth looked like. So what do we do about that meat? Is it okay to buy it? Is it okay to buy it? Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians 10. We're not going to read it, but you know what it says. Is it okay to buy it? Y'all can talk. It's okay. Oh, yeah, it's okay to buy it. You want to go buy it? That's all right. Is everybody going to buy it? Oh, no. Is there going to be somebody who says, is there going to be a Greg Smith who says, you ought not to be eating that stuff? Right, because I thought I'd be on the other side, but I'm not. So Greg Smith saying, you ought not to be eating that stuff, getting that idol stuff. There's going to be somebody like me. If you know I'm like that, are you supposed to buy it, serve it to me, and tell me where it came from? No. Why? Violate my conscience. But you know what? Anybody been invited over to somebody's house to eat? It's okay, y'all can say it. Yeah. Did you ever sit down at the meal and you look across the table and you just say, where did this steak come from? I don't know about y'all, but I don't ask questions like that. I just say, can you give me a fork? Right? Just going to eat it. So Paul says, hey, let's say somebody, especially an unbeliever, somebody that doesn't believe in Jesus, they invite you over to their house. And you go over to their house to eat, and they set a piece of meat in front of you, what are you not supposed to do? You're not supposed to question where it came from. Don't be arguing with them over that. What do you do with something that's set before you? You eat it. New Herman Church of Christ. Probably my sophomore year of college. There was a lady that attended that church. Her name was Grandma. Everybody loved Grandma. One Sunday, Grandma said, why don't you come to my house to eat? I thought, Grandma, I'd love to come to your house to eat. So I did. Went to Grandma's house. Sat down at Grandma's table. She went in the kitchen, brought back a bowl, set it in front of me, poke salad and eggs. I loved Grandma. What did I do with my poke salad and eggs? I ate it. Why did I eat it? One, because she gave it to me. And two, because I had my mama's voice in my ear. And what did my mama's voice say? You eat what they put in front of you, son. You don't complain about it. So I ate it, smiled, happy. A month later, Grandma said, "Why don't you come to my house and eat?" Okay. What did Grandma give me? Poke salad and eggs. Now I want to ask you, was this bowl of poke salad and eggs bigger than the last bowl of poke salad and eggs? Oh, yeah, because I liked it. The next time I went to see her, was that bowl bigger than the week before? Kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I think I was eating like out of the pan by the time the thing was through. I just eat it up, smile. Oh, Grandmama. Now, I don't mind poke salad and eggs, but there gets to be a level where it's like, I've had about all this I can stand. And Paul says, somebody who's an unbeliever invites you to their house. If they don't bring up a question of conscience, you don't bring a question of conscience. Eat what's set before you with thankfulness. What if they set it in front of you, and they know you're a believer, and they say, you know that was sacrificed to an idol, don't you? What do you do then? Don't eat it. Because of your conscience? Oh, no, because of their conscience. Because they're the one who told you that. They're the one who brought it up, and if they're the one who bring it up, don't eat it because it's their conscience, not your conscience. What, is it my right to eat it if I just want to exercise my right? Oh, yeah. Is it my right? Can I come into church on Sunday morning and say, I just want y'all to know I had the best T-bone steak last night, but I bought it down in the marketplace. It was sacrificed to an idol. Do I have the right to do that if I want? Yeah, I got a right. But should I? Man, he gets to 1 Corinthians 10, verse 24, and he just rips. You know how in America we always talk about our rights and what we have the right to do, and I got the right for this and the right for that, and I can do this if I want, and you can't tell me that I can't. And man, this is probably not America and the United States, but Paul comes along in 1 Corinthians 10, 24, and he just pulls a rug out underneath the whole thing. Nobody should seek his own good, but the good of others. See, my freedom is not about me. My freedom is about you. My freedom is not about doing the thing that I want to do. My freedom is about doing the thing that's beneficial to you. My freedom is about doing the thing that builds you up. Freedom's not about me. Freedom is about you. And so Paul views that through a lens that is completely opposite of the way that the world views rights. And you think, well, Greg, that's all really good, but we don't have a temple of Apollo. If we want to have a family get-together, we're not going to go to the temple of Apollo. We're going to use the fellowship hall. And the last time I checked, I didn't see a special discount for meat sacrificed to idols at Kroger. So what am I supposed to do with all of this? Look around your world. Boy, this could be a whole sermon series. Might be at some point. A lot of things that you have the right to do, but they're not the right thing to do. A lot of things that you might engage in, but they might not be the right thing to engage in. There might be some things that theologically would be fine for you to do at your home, but would not be fine for you to do in the presence of someone else who has a different thought or a different opinion or who's struggling with their faith. There might be things that you could stand up and say, well, God said I could, and Jesus would look at you and say, it's not that I said you could. I'm asking you, is it beneficial for your church family? Is it beneficial for fellow believers? Is it beneficial for those you have the opportunity to influence? You might have the right to go see a certain movie, but in some people's presence, maybe you shouldn't do that. You might have the right to eat or drink certain things, but maybe in some people's presence, you shouldn't do that. Maybe if you have the right to do it in your home, it'd be okay to do it there, but maybe you ought not to come to church and brag about it and talk about it. Maybe it's not sin to you, but maybe it's one of those things of conscience to someone else that for the sake of somebody else's conscience and their faith, you're willing to just lay it aside because you know what's good for your brothers. What if? And I've always said this. I think here is I really, in my heart, I know I'm too simplistic, okay? But I think in my heart, Paul just gave us something that would probably eliminate 98% of every church fight I have ever seen. Nobody should seek his own good, but the good of others. Those are powerful words. And it's powerful words about how Paul and the Corinthian church would relate to their culture, and the words are no less powerful for us because we deal with the same thing every day. I don't know where you are in your faith. Maybe you're not a believer. Maybe you need to be a believer. Maybe you're a believer and you kind of, it happens sometimes. We just kind of wander away. We just kind of forget who we are and what we're doing. Maybe you're the most faithful believer that the world has ever seen, but you got something going on in your life that you just need prayers, or you need to talk to somebody, or you need a church family to pray for you. But if you have a need this morning, I'm going to ask you to come while we stand and sing.